Welcome, ghouls, ghosts, and mere mortals, to the second episode of our cemetery fence build series. That's right, this is episode 2. In this episode, we are going to build our columns or pillars. Not quite sure what you're supposed to call them. If you know, feel free to put a little comment in the section below. I'm just not going to take the time to look it up myself. But anyway, we are going to build our columns that are going to go between our fence posts. So if you missed the first episode and want to learn how we got our cemetery fence and how to build a cemetery fence of your own, I'm going to put a link in the description below. Check it out, and then come back and watch the rest of this video. So, like I said, we're going to get to work on building our different pillars for the cemetery build. So let's get to work and start putting together some pillars, columns, pillar columns, column pillars, caterpillars. We're going to build no. Let's get to work. Alright, so let's go over the supplies that we used to build our cemetery pillars. We used 1-inch foam board. We used 2-inch foam board. 1x2 pieces of wood. Spray foam. Wood trim. And some magnets. Alright, so the first thing we did was measure out our 1x2s. The initial pieces I cut at 40 inches, and these are going to be the long pieces, the vertical pieces that are on the 4 corners of the pillars, and then also on the sides, which we'll get further more into why we're putting some on the sides later on. Maybe not in this video, probably in the follow-up video. And once we got all of those corner and side pieces cut, it was time to move on to the base and the top pieces. So once again, made our measurements. We went with 11 inches, and then time to make the cuts. So for each of the pillars, we needed 8 of these, 4 for the base and 4 for the top. Now, something that has helped me out quite a bit is labeling all of these pieces, so that way when it comes time to assemble them, I know exactly what goes where. I've had issues in the past where I might have put the wrong piece in the wrong place, so by labeling, it makes it that much easier and cuts down on mistakes, and I make a lot of mistakes. So we're making 3 separate cemetery pillars, so as you can see, I have 3 stacks of all the pieces that I need, so now it's time to get building. So to assemble the base pieces, I just went with my labeling method and arranged everything and kind of did a dry fit first, just to make sure that everything lined up right and make sure I have the wood configured in a way where it's going to fit the best. And then just some wood glue on either end of the pieces of wood. And then I just used my nail gun to secure the sides together. And then once I got my base and my top put together, it was time to start adding those side and corner pieces. Because this is a Halloween prop, it's not an actual, structure that I'm building. I wasn't really too concerned with making sure that these are plumb. I just kind of lined them up to the wood and did it by eye. But also, we're going to be attaching the bottom and the top to these corner pieces. So even if, like I said, even if they aren't plumb, it'll still line up pretty well. And same concept here. Wood glue, nail gun, get everything in place. On the bottom, flip it over, line it up with the top, and you're done with the corners. So let's move on to the sides. So in a future video, you'll see why we added these sides, and it's essentially to connect the actual fence to these pillars. So I just kind of roughly marked the center. I'm not being precise here because it's not a huge deal. Once again, this is a Halloween prop, but like I said, I marked the center, and then I took side pieces and attached them same way, glue and nails, And then something else I did with these side pieces is I added an additional just scrap piece of wood on the inside. So that way, whenever I nail it in with my nail gun, those nails don't poke through and then possibly cause an injury later on. Knowing my luck, I would just grab it right on the nail, not even thinking about it. So, safety first. And with all the corner pieces and the side pieces and the top and the bottom all assembled, this is what our pillars look like right now. These are the bones, I guess you could say, or the skeleton of these pillars. So now that that's done, we can move on to the foam. So like I said before, my pillars are going to be 40 inches tall. So I measured out 40 inches by, I think my pillars are some are 11, some are 12. So I measured out my width. And then I got to cutting using my hot knife. And then I did the same thing with the foam that I did with the wood pieces. I labeled these because 12 inches and 11 inches, it's not a big difference. It's hard to tell by looking at them. So this way I know exactly which ones are which. And then time to attach them to the base, to the skeleton. I'm using spray foam here. I'm putting it on the two corner pieces and the side piece, and then just resting that foam on top of it, lining it up to exactly where it needs to fit. And because foam expands as it dries, you want to weigh this down somehow. So as you can see here, I use some flower pots, some 2x4s, whatever you have handy. Could be tools, could be a chair or a table, I don't know, whatever works. Just make sure you have some weight on there. It's still going to expand slightly, even if you have it weighed down. But at least this way we can cut down on a lot of that expansion, and that'll help us out a lot later on in the build when we're trying to make it look like it's kind of a seamless piece of stone. Now I'm only gluing 3 sides on. The 4th side we're actually going to attach with magnets so we can have easy access to the inside of these pillars. My thought process is that later on I would like to probably add maybe additional lights or projectors, and I can hide them within the pillars. Also, I was thinking maybe for storage purposes, rather than have just a bunch of empty space, we can throw stuff inside of these and then put the magnet top on. So now that the 3 sides have been glued, it's time to do some cleanup, so that way we can attach the 4th side and have it as flush as possible with those magnets. So I just took my handsaw, sawzall, whatever you want to call it, jigsaw. I guess not a jigsaw, but anyway, I took my saw and just kind of ran it along the piece of wood and just cut off all that excess spray foam that had leaked out of the sides, just to make sure, like I said, I'd have that kind of snug fit whenever I put on the piece of foam with the magnets. And now it's time to put on the magnets. Now this does not have to be an exact science. You guys will see in a few moments how I line the magnet up pretty perfectly with the foam. So just kind of place the magnets where you want. I use 4 magnets per pillar, 2 at the top, 2 at the bottom. Now, any of you professional woodworkers or perfectionists might cringe a little bit about how I did this. I didn't have a drill bit that was the right size for the magnet. The biggest one I had was a 1/2 inch one without getting too big. So I used my 1/2 inch drill bit and just kind of ran it in a circle to get the full, I guess, width of the magnet. And then once I got that out of the way, then I kind of went through the middle. Yeah, it doesn't have to be perfect. We're going to glue it in there anyway. But sometimes you do what you have to do with the tools that you have. I was actually on one of my last magnets when I realized I could use my router for this. But at that point it was too late. I'd already gotten this far, so it is what it is. And then with those holes drilled, I just pumped a bunch of wood glue into those, put the magnet on top, and then use my rubber mallet to hammer them in because, they're magnets. They stick to metal, so don't want to use a regular hammer. And then once that wood glue dries, We're going to take the other magnets that we're going to eventually attach to the foam, put them on top of the magnets that are hammered into the wood, lay the foam on top, line it up to where it needs to be, and just kind of hit it with your hand. If you hit it hard enough, it's going to leave an indentation where the magnet is, so that way you know exactly where to place the magnet on the foam. Like I said, it doesn't have to be an exact science, it's a Halloween prop. And with those little indentations letting me know where to drill, I was able to drill in here. Now I use the same drill bit, but with this being foam, you want to be very careful. You don't want to go too far. You don't want to poke out the other side. And also with this being foam, it's a little bit easier to get the magnet in place. So I just kind of shoved it in. And once everything was lined up, I used spray foam to hold the magnets in place on the foam. But before we do that, before we put the magnets in place, something very important, you got to make sure you have the right side of the magnet. You don't want to go with that opposite end that's going to push away from each other. So be sure to line up the magnets first before you glue them into the foam. Make sure it's the right side, and then stick it in that foam with that spray foam, and you should be good to go. And you don't need a lot of spray foam either. I should have mentioned that as well. I don't know if you saw that top corner that I just did, but just a little tiny bit because it does expand. So don't really need much, just enough to hold that magnet in place. And then I did stick a 2x4 on top of these just to keep them pushed down as they dried. So while the glue is drying and the spray foam is drying with the magnets, I moved on to the base of the pillars. So I want about a 2-inch base that sticks out around the bottom, just to kind of match it up a little bit with the existing pillars that we're going to use for the cemetery gate. I just did 2 inches and I went very wide because I'm going to be trimming this down later on. We'll get to that in just a few moments, but I made 12, because we have 3 pillars, 2-inch pieces of foam. I used the 2-inch foam for this as well to get those base pieces created. And then with the base pieces cut, I measured each side of these pillars so that way I knew exactly what size to make them. Because, like I said before, that foam expands. The way you had it measured previously whenever you got started is probably not where it is right now. Like you can see 13.1, 12.3. They expanded just ever so slightly. And then we're just going to cut a 45-degree angle on either side of those foam pieces for the base. Now, I am not great at cutting angles for trim. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. But you'll see here in a minute when I go to line them up, they're not going to line up perfectly, and honestly, that's okay. So I cut both sides at an angle, and then I did a dry fit just to make sure it fit properly. And as you can see, it doesn't line up perfectly, and that's okay. We'll fix that later on. But took that expanding foam, sprayed it on, placed the trim pieces where they need to go, and then I just held them in place with some heavy objects that I had, a piece of wood and some paver stones. And then I sprayed some extra foam so that way it fills up those gaps, and that way we can trim that later on. And then I had a little mishap during this process. I actually knocked over our can of dry lock and had to clean that up, so it caused a little bit of a delay. But once we got the foam trim down, then I moved on to the wood trim, and same thing here, 45-degree angles, measure it, make sure it lines up properly with that dry fit. And then once that foam dries, that is holding in the bottom trim, the foam trim, then we'll shave it down and place that wood trim in. And that's going to be a good stopping point for this episode. We'll get further into the build in the next episode, but for now, let's take a look at our current results. right, guys, that's going to do it for this episode. I hope everyone enjoyed it. This episode was a bit of a slog. We're just building. Doesn't quite look like a column yet. It's just bone, really. But the next episode, that's when it's going to get exciting. That's when we're going to build the toppers. That's when we're going to get to sanding and painting and weathering and adding lights and all the exciting stuff that's going to make these look like actual stone columns. So you definitely want to stick around for that one. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, you might want to consider doing so. That way you can be notified when that video comes out, or when any other video comes out for that matter. But for now, we're going to wrap things up. So, happy haunting, and we'll see you in the next one.
Congratulations. You made it to the end of the video. As a reward for sticking around, you may now watch one of these two videos. The choice is yours, but choose wisely.